Close your eyes and imagine standing among ancient ruins as twilight settles over the Mediterranean. Broken marble columns rise around you, their surfaces carved with images of creatures frozen in stone, winged beasts, serpentine forms, figures caught between human and animal. The warm evening breeze carries the scent of wild thyme and ancient mysteries. These stone guardians have watched over these ruins for millennia, silent witnesses to the passage of ages. Rest now, and let us tell you their stories. First, introduction. When gods created nightmares, Greek mythology gave us heroes whose names echo through history. Heracles, Perseus, Odysseus, Theseus. Warriors who battled impossible odds, completed legendary quests, and earned immortality through their courage. But heroes need adversaries. Heroes need challenges that test not just their strength, but their cunning, their will to survive, their very souls. And so the Greeks created monsters. These weren't just random beasts, conjured for dramatic effect. Greek monsters had genealogies, families, purposes. They were born from primordial forces of chaos, brought into being by angry gods seeking revenge, or transformed from humans or nymphs through divine curse. Each monster represented something, well, a fear to conquer, a boundary to maintain, a price to pay for transgression. They guarded forbidden places, punished the wicked, and reminded mortals that the world contained forces beyond human comprehension or control. The greatest monsters shared common parentage. In a cave deep beneath the earth, two beings came together to spawn nightmares. Typhon, the deadliest creature ever to challenge Zeus's rule, and Echidna, half woman and half serpent, known as the Mother of Monsters. From their union came a brood of terrors that would plague heroes and mortals for generations. Multi-headed serpents, fire-breathing chimeras, riddle-speaking sphinxes, and hounds with heads beyond counting. These creatures weren't random chaos. They were chaos given form and purpose, obstacles placed deliberately in the paths of heroes, tests designed by fate or vengeful gods to winnow out the weak and glorify the strong. To face a Greek monster was to face death in its most creative and terrifying manifestations. And the truly horrifying part? Death would have been merciful compared to some fates these creatures inflicted. Tonight, we're counting down the 10 most terrifying monsters from Greek mythology. We're not ranking them by how famous they are, or how many heroes they killed, but by the pure, visceral terror they represent. The nightmare fuel that made ancient Greeks shudder when storytellers spoke their names. These are the creatures that embodied humanity's deepest fears: being devoured, being trapped, being transformed, being forgotten, and worst of all, being unable to escape. Let's descend into the depths of Greek mythology and meet the monsters that made heroes necessary. Furthermore, for 10, the Harpies, storm winds with talons. We begin our countdown with creatures that combine two of humanity's most primal terrors: being hunted from above and being contaminated beyond redemption. The Harpies, whose name literally means snatchers, were winged spirits of sudden, sharp winds and storm gusts, but they were so much more than mere weather phenomena. They were divine punishment made flesh, filth, and feathers. The Harpies originated as daughters of Thaumas, an ancient sea god, and Electra, an oceanid nymph. This made them sisters to Iris, the beautiful rainbow goddess and messenger of Hera, a striking contrast that emphasizes how the same divine bloodline could produce both beauty and horror. While their sister Iris flew on graceful wings, delivering messages between gods and mortals, The Harpies flew to steal, defile, and torment. In their earliest depictions, Harpies appeared as beautiful winged maidens, swift creatures of the wind who carried away those who had vanished without explanation. They weren't necessarily evil. They were agents of divine will, taking what the gods decreed should be taken. But over time, as their most famous myth developed, the Harpies transformed in the Greek imagination into something far more disgusting and terrifying. By the classical period, artists and poets described Harpies as having women's faces, sometimes beautiful, sometimes hideous, but their bodies were those of birds of prey, complete with razor-sharp talons, powerful wings, and the lean, predatory bodies of hunting hawks. Their feathers were often described as filthy and matted, their claws sharp enough to rend flesh, their voices a horrible shrieking that announced their arrival like a death knell. But physical appearance alone didn't make the Harpies terrifying. What made them nightmares was what they did and what they represented: corruption, starvation, and the inability to satisfy the most basic human need for nourishment. The Harpies specialized in a torture so creative, so perfectly calibrated to drive a person mad, that it became their defining characteristic. Their most famous victim was Phineus, a king of Thrace who had been granted the gift of prophecy by Apollo. But Phineus made a terrible mistake. He revealed too much, sharing divine secrets with mortals, unveiling futures that the gods had intended to keep hid. For this transgression, Zeus imposed a punishment worthy of the underworld itself. Phineus would live in eternal hunger, but would never be able to eat. The mechanism of this torture was the Harpies. Whenever food was placed before the blind king, and yes, Zeus had also struck him blind, because the gods believed in comprehensive punishment, the Harpies would descend from the sky in a screeching flock. They would snatch most of the food away in their talons, carrying it off to places unknown. But worse than stealing the food was what they did to what remained. The Harpies would defile it, covering everything with their excrement, rendering it so foul-smelling and contaminated that no one could bear to eat it. Imagine this torture: you're starving, wasting away, your body consuming itself for lack of nourishment. Food is placed before you. You can smell it, can hear others describing it, can feel its warmth if you reach out. But before you can take a single bite, the attack comes. Wind from powerful wings, the screech of bird monsters, the feeling of talons grazing your skin as they tear away most of what you need to survive, and what remains, covered in filth, reeking, inedible, a mockery of sustenance that only makes your hunger more agonizing. Day after day, meal after meal, year after year, Phineus endured this torture. He grew skeletal, his body so emaciated that his bones showed through translucent skin. He was dying slowly, constantly on the edge of starvation, but unable to cross fully into death's release. The Harpies had become his personal demons, his eternal tormentors, the physical manifestation of divine punishment that could neither be escaped nor endured, but which he had to endure nonetheless. The torment continued until Jason and the Argonauts arrived at Phineus's palace during their quest for the Golden Fleece. Among the Argonauts were the Boreads, Calais and Zetes, sons of Boreas, the North Wind. These brothers had their own wings, inherited from their divine father, which meant they could pursue the Harpies through their own element, the sky. When Phineus's next meal was laid out and the Harpies descended, The Boreads launched themselves into the air after them. A aerial chase ensued, the wind-born sons of the North Wind pursuing the Storm Maidens across vast distances. In some versions, the Boreads caught the Harpies and prepared to kill them, but Iris, their rainbow goddess sister, intervened. She swore on the river Styx, the unbreakable oath, that the Harpies would never torment Phineus again. If the Boreads spared them, the pursuit ended at the Strophotes Islands, whose name literally means Islands of Turning, marking the place where the chase reversed direction. The Harpies were allowed to live, but forbidden from tormenting Phineus. The old king finally could eat in peace, though his body was so damaged by years of starvation that full recovery proved impossible. But the Harpies' role in Greek mythology didn't end with Phineus. They appeared in other stories as agents of her divine vengeance, snatching away those who had angered the gods, carrying off children, or stealing items never to be recovered. They represented the wind that could whip things away before you could react, the contamination that rendered resources useless, the arbitrary cruelty of divine punishment where innocence offered no protection. The Harpies also embodied a specifically Greek horror, the pollution that came from improper contact with the divine. In Greek religious thought, certain transgressions created miasma, spiritual pollution that contaminated everything it touched. The Harpies were physical manifestations of this concept, creatures whose very touch defiled, whose presence corrupted, who turned abundance into foulness and life, giving sustenance into something repulsive and untouchable. Why do the Harpies rank number 10 on our list, despite this horrifying description? Because compared to what's coming, the Harpies had limits. They could be escaped, the Boreads proved that. They could be bargained with, as Iris's intervention showed. And they weren't universally destructive. They served specific purposes, punished specific targets. As divine agents, they had rules they followed, boundaries they wouldn't cross. The monsters higher on our list had no such limitations. But don't mistake ranking number 10 for being harmless. The Harpies represented the terror of having your most basic needs transformed into sources of suffering, of contamination that couldn't be cleansed, of punishment from which there was no appeal. They were winged nightmares that stole not just objects, but the possibility of sustenance itself, leaving their victims to waste away while surrounded by plenty they couldn't access. The ancient Greeks who heard stories of Phineus's torment understood what the Harpies symbolized: the cruelty of divine justice, the horror of being kept alive only to suffer, and the terrible creativity the gods employed when designing punishments. The Harpies weren't random monsters to slay and forget. They were instruments of divine will, and that made them infinitely more frightening than any beast acting on mere instinct. Further to number 9, the Grey, 3 crones sharing one eye from creatures of defiling contamination. We move to monsters whose very existence embodied incompleteness and mutual dependency, taken to nightmarish extremes. The Grey, whose name means the Grey Ones, or the Old Women, were 3 sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth among them, living in perpetual twilight at the edge of the known world, born from the ancient sea deities Phorcys and Ceto, whose monstrous offspring included not only the Grey Eye, but also their more famous sisters, the Gorgons, as well as Scylla, Echidna, and various other nightmares. The Grey were named Dano, Dread, Enyo, horror, and Pimfredo, alarm. Their very names announced their nature. They were meant to inspire fear, to unsettle, to disturb anyone who encountered them. But the most disturbing thing about the Grey wasn't their names or their parentage. It was the fact that they were born old, not aged gradually over time, not cursed to premature aging, but created as ancient crones from the moment of their existence. They came into the world with gray hair, withered skin, and the appearance of women who had lived for centuries, though they had only just begun existing. Imagine being born ancient, never knowing youth, never experiencing the vitality and potential of a fresh start. The Grey were denied even the memory of better days, because there had never been better days. The three sisters shared only one eye among them. Not one eye each, one eye total. They had to pass this single eye back and forth, taking turns seeing, spending most of their existence in darkness, while one sister had her brief turn at vision. Picture this. You're blind most of the time, dependent on your sisters to share what they see when they have the eye. You wait for your turn, reaching out your hand to receive the precious eye when your sister relinquishes it. For that brief moment when the eye is between hands. During the transfer, all three sisters are completely blind, and they only had one tooth among them as well. One single tooth for three mouths, passed around when one needed to chew, making eating a communal activity requiring coordination and trust. The body horror of this arrangement is difficult to overstate. These were beings perpetually incomplete, perpetually dependent, perpetually vulnerable because they lacked basic components of individual existence. The Grey lived somewhere near the Garden of the Hesperides, at the far western edge of the world, where the sun set and perpetual twilight reigned. They served as guardians of their more dangerous sisters, the Gorgons, including Medusa. They were the sentinels, the lookouts, the ones who would warn Medusa and her sisters if anyone approached seeking to do them harm. This role made them crucial targets for Perseus when he set out to slay Medusa. The hero needed to know where the Gorgons lived, what defenses protected them, and how he might approach without being detected. The Grey possessed this knowledge, but they would never share it willingly. Perseus would have to force them to betray their sisters. And so Perseus, guided by Hermes and Athena, went to the Grey's dwelling in the Twilight Lands. He found the three ancient sisters sitting together, passing their single eye among themselves as they maintained their endless watch. And Perseus waited, patient as any hunter, for the perfect moment, when one sister lifted her hand to pass the eye to another. When the eye was in mid-transfer and all three were momentarily blind, Perseus struck. He snatched the eye from the air, stealing their collective vision in an instant. The Grey erupted in alarm, their withered hands grasping at empty air, their voices raised in distress and anger. But without their eye, they were helpless. Three ancient, blind women with no defense against the hero, who held their only means of sight. Perseus made his demands. Tell him how to find the Gorgons, or he would keep the eye forever, leaving them in permanent blindness. The Grey had no choice. They gave Perseus the information he needed, not just the Gorgon's location, but also directions to the nymphs who guarded the magical items Perseus would need. The winged sandals, the helm of invisibility, and the Kibisis bag that could safely hold Medusa's severed head. What happened to the eye after Perseus got what he needed varies by source. Some say he returned it to them, showing honor even to monsters. Others claim he threw it into a lake, condemning the Graea to eternal blindness as punishment for guarding the Gorgons. The cruelest version suggests he tossed it over his shoulder as he left, forcing the three sisters to scrabble around blindly, trying to recover their precious shared sight. The Graea represent a uniquely visceral horror that's different from the terror of being attacked or devoured. They embody the nightmare of incompleteness, of being perpetually dependent on others for basic functions most beings take for granted. Imagine never being able to be alone because you cannot function without your sisters nearby. Imagine the constant negotiation required just to see or eat, the loss of autonomy, the vulnerability inherent in needing others for tasks that should be individual. There's also a body horror aspect to the Graea that goes beyond their shared organs. The image of withered hands passing a single eyeball back and forth, of ancient mouths waiting for a single tooth to chew their food, creates a revulsion that's almost physical. These aren't wounds that might heal or conditions that might improve. This is their permanent state of existence, their nature, what they are and always will be. The Graea also represent the horror of aging taken to mythic extremes. They were born old and presumably grew even older, becoming more decrepit, more withered, more ancient with each passing year. But they couldn't die. They were immortal beings condemned to endless existence in bodies that belonged to the elderly, experiencing all the frailties of advanced age without any of the compensations of accumulated wisdom or respected elder status. They were just old forever, getting older. Their role as guardians who failed adds another layer to their tragedy. The one job they had, protecting their Gorgon sisters, they proved unable to fulfill when a clever hero exploited their fundamental vulnerability. That moment when Perseus stole their eye was the moment they failed in their purpose, the moment they became not protectors, but obstacles overcome, not threats, but victims of the hero's cunning. Why do the Graea rank number 9 instead of higher? Because for all their disturbing qualities, they weren't aggressive threats. They didn't hunt heroes or devour innocents. They sat in their twilight realm, passing their eye and tooth among themselves, harming no one except those who came seeking them out. They were horrifying in concept, disturbing in appearance, tragic in their existence, but they weren't actively dangerous in the way that higher-ranked monsters would prove to be. Yet the Graea linger in imagination, precisely because of how disturbing they are. Long after you've forgotten the details of battles with dragons or chimeras, you remember the image of 3 ancient women sharing a single eye, passing it back and forth with withered hands, living in perpetual incompleteness and mutual dependency. That image burrows into your mind and stays there, a reminder that monstrousness doesn't always require fangs or claws. Sometimes it just requires being just different enough from normal to inspire visceral discomfort. The Graea are the nightmare of codependency taken to impossible extremes, of aging without end, of incompleteness as a permanent state of being. They're the terror of losing basic autonomy and never getting it back. And they're a reminder that in Greek mythology, even minor monsters, who only appear briefly in heroic tales, can embody concepts disturbing enough to haunt the imagination centuries after they were first conceived. Kate, Scylla, from beauty to six-headed horror, we ascend from the twilight lands where the Grey dwell into the bright waters of the Mediterranean, where a different kind of horror awaits. One that was once beautiful, once innocent, once a victim before becoming a predator. This is Scylla, and her story is as tragic as it is terrifying. Scylla began as a sea nymph of remarkable beauty. In some versions, she was simply a lovely naiad who caught the eye of gods and sea creatures alike. In the most famous telling, preserved by the Roman poet Ovid, Scylla was so beautiful that Glaucus, a minor sea god, fell desperately in love with her. But Scylla didn't return his affection. She fled from his advances, seeking refuge on land where the sea god couldn't follow. Glaucus, consumed by unrequited love, sought help from the sorceress Circe, that famous witch who would later transform Odysseus's men into swine. He begged Circe for a love potion that would make Scylla return his feelings. But Circe had her own designs. She had fallen in love with Glaucus herself, and she saw Scylla as a rival to be eliminated, not aided. Circe told Glaucus she would help him, but instead of preparing a love charm, she brewed a poison. She went to the pool where Scylla bathed, the clear waters where the beautiful nymph would swim and splash. Unaware of the doom approaching, Circe poured her magical poison into the water, contaminating it with dark sorcery, transforming it from refreshing spring to cursed pool. When Scylla entered the water, the transformation began immediately. From her waist down, her beautiful body began to change, to twist, to mutate into something monstrous. 6 long serpentine necks sprouted from where her waist had been, each neck topped with a head. Not human heads, but the heads of dogs, complete with pointed ears, slavering jaws, and multiple rows of razor-sharp teeth. 12 legs or tentacles grew from her transformed lower body, writhing masses of flesh that anchored her in place. Her transformation was complete. Where once had been a beautiful woman, was now a monster with a woman's torso atop a nightmare of dog heads and writhing appendages. Scylla's horror and anguish at her transformation were absolute. She tried to pull away the dog heads, tried to stop the writhing of her new limbs, tried desperately to reverse what had been done to her. But the transformation was permanent, irreversible, and Circe's curse ensured that Scylla could never fully control her new form. The dog heads had minds of their own, snapping and snarling at whatever came near, driven by an insatiable hunger that Scylla herself didn't necessarily feel, but couldn't control. In her anguish, Scylla retreated to the Strait of Messina, that narrow passage of water between mainland Italy and Sicily. She found a cave in the cliff face on one side of the strait, and there she made her lair, her body transformed into a fixture of the geography, half woman, half monster, trapped between her human mind and her monstrous form. But Scylla wasn't alone in the strait. On the opposite side lurked Charybdis, another transformed maiden. This one turned into a whirlpool that sucked down ships whole. Between Scylla's cliff and Charybdis's whirlpool, the strait became a death trap for sailors. Navigate too close to Scylla's side, and the dogheads would snatch men from the deck. Sail too close to Charybdis, and the entire ship would be dragged into the vortex. There was no safe passage, only a choice between which doom to risk. Scylla's 6 dogheads could strike independently, each one lunging out on its long neck to snatch sailors from passing ships. The heads would dart out like serpents striking, seizing men in their jaws, and pull them back into the cave where screams would echo briefly before falling silent, Scylla would devour them. Or rather, the dogheads would, driven by their endless hunger, while Scylla's human consciousness was forced to experience and remember every kill, every meal of human flesh, every transformation from potential rescuer to victim to food. The most famous encounter with Scylla came when Odysseus navigated the strait during his long journey home from Troy. Warned by the witch Circe herself about the dangers ahead, Odysseus faced an impossible choice: risk Charybdis and potentially lose his entire ship and crew, or pass closer to Scylla and accept that he would lose exactly 6 men, 1 to each doghead. Odysseus chose Scylla. He didn't tell his men what awaited them, knowing that if they understood the danger, panic would doom them all. He steered the ship closer to Scylla's cliff, keeping his course steady while privately gripping his spear, hoping perhaps to fight off the monster if she struck. But there was no fighting Scylla. As the ship passed beneath her cave, the 6 dogheads struck in perfect coordination, each one snatching a different sailor from the deck. Odysseus watched helplessly as 6 of his best men were plucked into the air, their screams of terror and calls for help mixing with the snarling of the dogheads. They were carried up toward the cave, still reaching back toward the ship, still begging for rescue, until they disappeared into darkness and their voices were cut off. Later, Odysseus would describe this as the most heartbreaking moment of his entire journey. Not the encounter with the Cyclops, not the year spent trapped by Circe, not even the loss of all his remaining crew, but this moment when he had to willingly sacrifice 6 men to Scylla's hunger, knowing it was going to happen, unable to prevent it, forced to hear their final cries for help that he couldn't answer. The horror of Scylla operates on multiple levels. First, there's the body horror of her transformation. A beautiful woman turned into a multi-headed dog monster, a being that's neither one thing nor another, a fusion that shouldn't exist and wouldn't exist except for jealous magic. The image of 6 dog heads on long necks, all snapping and snarling independently, creates a visceral revulsion that's hard to shake. But there's also the tragedy of her situation. Scylla didn't choose to become a monster. She was innocent, a victim of circumstance, caught between Glaucus's unwanted affection and Circe's jealous rage. Her transformation was punishment for the crime of being beautiful and being desired, a fate imposed on her by others' emotions that had nothing to do with her own actions or desires. And then there's the ongoing horror of her existence. Scylla is trapped in her cave, unable to leave, her body literally anchored to the cliff. She can't return to her old life, can't undo her transformation, can't even control her own body fully. The dogheads act on their own hungry impulses. She's forced to kill to survive, forced to hear the screams of her victims, forced to remember when she was the beautiful nymph who would never have chosen this existence. Every ship that passes is both a hope and a horror. Perhaps this ship carries someone who could help her, who could break the curse, who could give her back her former life. But when the dogheads strike and devour sailors, that hope dies with them. She becomes more of a monster with each kill, more irredeemable, more defined by what she does, rather than who she once was. The phrase, between Scylla and Charybdis, entered language as a description of choosing between 2 equally terrible options, of facing a dilemma where either choice leads to disaster. This linguistic legacy speaks to Scylla's enduring power in mythology. She represents the impossible choice, the situation where there is no good option, where loss is inevitable and the only question is what kind of loss you'll accept. Scylla ranks number 8 on our list because, while she's terrifying and her tragedy is profound, she's ultimately localized to one geographic area. Avoid the Strait of Messina and you avoid Scylla. Her danger is great, but not universal. Her horror significant, but contained. The monsters ranking higher on our list can't be so easily avoided. But Scylla's story resonates because it combines physical horror with psychological tragedy. She's the victim who became the monster, the innocent punished for others' crimes, the being trapped in a form she never wanted, and forced to commit acts she likely never intended. In her cave in the Strait of Messina, Scylla remains forever, the beautiful nymph who became 6 dog heads on writhing necks, snatching sailors from ships, devouring them while her human mind screams in protest, unable to stop, unable to escape, unable to die, unable to become anything except what jealous magic made her against her will. The ancient Greeks sailing through those waters would look up at the cliffs and wonder if Scylla was there, watching, waiting, her 6 dog heads ready to strike. And they would remember that in Greek mythology, beauty offered no protection from transformation, innocence no shield against punishment, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters were those who never chose to become monstrous. First to 7, the Sphinx. Wisdom that devours. From the sea-swept cliffs where Scylla waits, we travel to the rocky road approaching Thebes, where a very different kind of monster posed a very different kind of threat. The Sphinx didn't attack with fangs or claws, didn't snatch victims from ships, or transform them into stone. The Sphinx killed with knowledge, or rather, with the lack of it. She devoured those who couldn't answer her riddle, and in doing so, she demonstrated that ignorance could be just as fatal as any monster's teeth. The Sphinx was born from the terrible union of Typhon and Echidna, making her sister to Cerberus, the Hydra, and the Chimera. All creatures will encounter higher on our list. But where her siblings were purely bestial nightmares of tooth and claw, the Sphinx combined animal ferocity with human intelligence in ways that made her uniquely dangerous. Her body was that of a lion, powerful, tawny, with massive paws tipped with retractable claws. Lion-like strength filled her limbs, giving her the power to overpower any human who tried to flee or fight. From her lion shoulders grew the wings of an eagle, enormous pinions that allowed her to fly, to perch on high places, to drop down upon victims from above. Her tail, depending on the source, was either a lion's tail or that of a serpent, adding yet another animal element to her composite form. But most unnerving was her face. The Sphinx had a woman's head atop her lion body. Not a monstrous face, but, according to many descriptions, a beautiful one. She could speak, think, reason in ways no mere beast could. She possessed intelligence, cunning, knowledge of riddles, and their answers. This combination of human intellect with animal power created something more dangerous than either alone. The Sphinx didn't hunt randomly. She was sent to Thebes specifically by Hera, or Ares depending on the source, as punishment for that city's sins. King Laius of Thebes had committed crimes that angered the gods. Some sources say he kidnapped and violated a boy named Chrysippus. Others cite different transgressions. But regardless of the specific reason, divine vengeance took the form of the Sphinx, and Thebes would pay the price for its king's crimes. The monster perched herself on a large rock on Mount Physium or Physium, outside the gates of Thebes, commanding the main road into the city. Anyone attempting to enter or leave Thebes would have to pass her position, and she would descend from her rock and block their path. And then she would pose her riddle. The riddle itself has become one of the most famous puzzles in all of mythology. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? The answer seems obvious now, after centuries of retelling, but imagine encountering it for the first time with no cultural knowledge of this riddle's famous nature, while a lion-bodied, eagle-winged monster with a beautiful woman's face stares at you expectantly, knowing that your life depends on your answer. Travelers stood before the Sphinx and tried to solve her puzzle. They guessed various answers, offered different solutions, reasoned through possibilities while the monster waited, patient and predatory. And when they got the answer wrong, as nearly everyone did, the Sphinx would devour them. She would use her lion's strength, her eagle's wings, her serpent's tail in some versions, and kill the failed riddler, consuming their flesh right there on the road to Thebes. The bodies piled up, the road to Thebes became a place of death, strewn with the remains of those who couldn't solve the riddle. Travelers approaching the city would see the evidence of the Sphinx's power: bones picked clean, clothing torn and bloody, the detritus of countless failed attempts to outwit the monster. The city itself became isolated, a prison for its inhabitants, because anyone trying to leave faced the Sphinx, and anyone trying to enter from outside never made it through. The psychological horror of the Sphinx went beyond physical danger. This wasn't a mindless beast you could potentially outfight or outmaneuver. This was an intelligent being who tested your knowledge, your ability to think abstractly, your cleverness. And she did so knowing that most people would fail, that she had chosen a riddle difficult enough to stump nearly everyone, that the bones littering the roadside were proof of how rarely anyone passed her test. There's something uniquely terrifying about facing a test you're likely to fail, especially when the price of failure is death. Warriors who might face monsters with courage found themselves hesitating before the Sphinx. Because how do you prepare for a riddle? How do you train to solve puzzles? Strength and weapon skill meant nothing here. Only wit mattered, and wit is harder to measure, harder to develop, harder to trust in a life or death moment. The Sphinx's blockade continued until Oedipus arrived, the young man fleeing his own destiny, though ultimately running straight toward it, approached Thebes and found his path blocked by the monster on her rock. The Sphinx descended, spread her wings to demonstrate her power, and posed her famous riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus thought. And then he answered, man. Man crawls on hands and knees as a baby in the morning of his life, walks on 2 legs as an adult at the noon of his life, and walks with a cane for support, 3 legs in the evening of his life in old age. The answer was correct. For the first time, someone had solved the Sphinx's riddle, and the monster, bound by the rules of her own challenge, had no choice but to acknowledge his success. In some versions, she simply allowed him to pass. But in the most famous version, the Sphinx was so distraught at being beaten, at having someone finally solve her riddle, that she threw herself from her rock and died on the rocks below. Why did solving her riddle lead to suicide? Some scholars suggest the Sphinx could only exist as long as her riddle remained unsolved, that her purpose and power were tied to the impossibility of the puzzle, and once someone answered correctly, she ceased to have meaning. Others argue that her pride couldn't bear defeat, that being outwitted destroyed her more thoroughly than any weapon could have. Still, others suggest that divine magic bound her to Thebes for as long as the riddle remained unsolved, and Oedipus's correct answer freed her. But freedom meant the end of her existence in this form, a death that was simultaneously liberation. The tragedy is that Oedipus, in solving the riddle, demonstrated precisely the kind of cleverness and wisdom that would later lead to his downfall. The same mind that understood how man's life progressed through ages would later realize the horror of his own life, that he had killed his father and married his mother, fulfilling the very prophecy he tried to escape. The Sphinx's riddle about the ages of man became bitterly ironic for Oedipus, whose own progression through life stages would be marked by patricide, incest, self-blinding, and exile. The Sphinx represents a uniquely intellectual horror, the terror of being tested and found wanting, of facing a challenge where your usual strengths are useless, of knowing that the margin between life and death is simply whether your mind works quickly enough, cleverly enough, correctly enough. It's the nightmare of the exam you can't prepare for, the question you can't answer, the test where failure is permanent. But there's also something deeply unsettling about a monster that combines human and animal so completely. The Sphinx could think like a human, speak like a human, reason like a human, but she had the body of a lion and would kill you like a predator without hesitation or mercy if you failed her test. That combination of civilization, the riddle, language, logic, with savagery devouring those who fail, creates a cognitive dissonance that's fundamentally disturbing. The Sphinx ranks number 7 on our list, because while she's terrifying and her method of killing is unique, she ultimately had a single weakness that could be exploited. Her riddle had an answer. Once someone clever enough came along, she was defeated. The monsters ranking higher on our list have no such simple solutions, no riddles that can be solved to end their threat. But the Sphinx's legacy endures because she represents knowledge weaponized, wisdom turned into a tool of death, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the difference between life and death isn't strength or speed, but simply whether you know the right answer at the right time. The ancient Greeks, who valued wisdom and cleverness as highly as martial prowess, found the Sphinx particularly horrifying because she demonstrated that even the mind, that supposedly safe, superior aspect of humanity, could become just another way to die. Number 6, Cerberus, the hand that guards death. We've reached number 6 on our list, and here we encounter a creature so fundamental to Greek mythology that his name has become synonymous with impassable guardianship. Cerberus, the many-headed hound of Hades, the beast that stands between the living world and the realm of death, ensuring that what crosses that threshold never returns. Cerberus was born from the same monstrous lineage as the Sphinx, the Chimera, and the Hydra. offspring of Typhon and Echidna, products of the father and mother of monsters. But where some of his siblings were sent out into the world to terrorize mortals and challenge heroes, Cerberus had a different purpose, a more permanent post. He was given to Hades, god of the underworld, to serve as guardian of the gates that led to the realm of the dead. The ancient sources vary wildly on Cerberus's exact appearance, which is itself telling. It suggests that the Greeks understood this creature as something beyond precise description, something that shifted depending on who encountered him. The most common depiction, the one that has dominated art and literature for millennia, gives Cerberus 3 heads, 3 massive dog heads, each one fully functional, each able to bite and tear independently, creating a guardian that could watch multiple directions simultaneously. But Hesiod, one of the earliest Greek poets, described Cerberus as having 50 heads. 50 heads would make Cerberus less a dog, and more a Hydra-like mass of snapping jaws, a creature so covered in heads that there would be no angle of approach that wasn't met with teeth. Other sources go even further, claiming Cerberus had 100 heads, or even more, turning him into something mathematically overwhelming. You could kill a few heads, but there would always be more ready to attack. Most sources, however, settled on 3 heads as the standard depiction, perhaps because 3 was a sacred number in Greek religion, or perhaps because 3 heads were enough to watch all directions while remaining imaginable. These weren't small dog heads either. Ancient descriptions and artistic depictions show them as massive, with gaping jaws, rows of sharp teeth, and the powerful crushing bite of a mastiff or warhound. But Cerberus's horror went beyond multiple heads. His neck and back were covered in living snakes, serpents that writhed and hissed, creating an additional layer of defense. If you somehow got past the heads, the snakes would strike, their venom lethal, their fangs ready. His tail, depending on the source, was either a serpent itself or ended in a serpent's head, meaning that even from behind, Cerberus was dangerous. Some descriptions give him a mane of serpents instead of fur, making his entire body a mass of scales, fangs, and venom. His size varied by account, but most agree that Cerberus was enormous, not dog-sized, but closer to the size of a bull or larger, a creature whose heads alone would have been at the height of a tall man's chest. His paws, in some versions, were bronze, either as natural coloring or actual metal, giving him extra weight and power, making his strikes devastating. Cerberus's job was twofold and equally important. First, he prevented the living from entering the underworld. Anyone attempting to descend into Hades while still alive would face Cerberus, and the hound would attack with all his heads, all his snakes, all his considerable power. The few who successfully entered the underworld alive, heroes like Heracles, Orpheus, Aeneas, and Theseus, all had to deal with Cerberus in one way or another. But Cerberus's second role was even more important and infinitely more chilling. He prevented the dead from leaving. Once you crossed the river Styx and passed through Hades' gates, once your shade joined the countless dead in the underworld, you were there forever. And if you tried to escape, if you thought you could somehow flee back to the world of the living, Cerberus was waiting. He would devour shades that tried to leave, tearing apart the souls of the dead, ensuring that death remained permanent and the border between life and death remained absolute. This is the deepest horror Cerberus represents, the finality of death. He's the physical embodiment of the fact that you cannot return, that death is a one-way journey, that the barrier between the living world and the underworld is not just symbolic but enforced by a monster specifically designed to make it impossible to cross back. When ancient Greeks thought about death, they thought about descending into darkness, crossing the Styx, paying Corin the ferryman, and then entering through gates guarded by a beast with multiple heads and serpents for hair that would ensure you never left. The famous myths involving Cerberus all emphasize different aspects of his terror. Heracles' 12th and final labor required him to descend into the underworld and bring Cerberus back to the surface without using weapons. Heracles had to wrestle the multi-headed hound into submission with his bare hands, grappling with a creature covered in snakes, dealing with multiple sets of jaws trying to bite him, using pure strength to overpower the guardian of death itself. He succeeded, bringing Cerberus briefly to the surface, where the hound's drool created poisonous plants, then returned him to his post. Because even Heracles understood that the boundary between life and death needed its guardian. Orpheus, the legendary musician, took a different approach when he descended to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice. He played his lyre so beautifully that Cerberus was lulled into sleep, allowing Orpheus to pass. This suggests that Cerberus, for all his ferocity, could be affected by music, by beauty, by art. A surprisingly vulnerable quality in such a fearsome guardian. The hero Aeneas, according to Virgil's epic, used a drugged honey cake to put Cerberus to sleep. This version presents the hound as having dog-like weaknesses. He could be distracted by food, could be poisoned or drugged like any animal. But this didn't make him less terrifying. It just meant that with proper preparation and knowledge, he could be bypassed rather than defeated. With these exceptional cases, heroes who managed to pass Cerberus through strength, art, or cunning only emphasized how impassable he was to everyone else. For every hero who made it past, countless others never even attempted the journey because they knew Cerberus waited. The hound's reputation alone kept most people from trying to violate the boundary between life and death. Cerberus also represents psychological horror beyond physical danger. He's the embodiment of finality, of irreversibility, of limits that cannot be transgressed. He represents the truth that some boundaries are absolute, that death cannot be cheated or escaped, except in the rarest, most exceptional circumstances, that the natural order includes rules that even heroes cannot break without divine permission. The ancient Greeks feared death, as humans always have, but they also understood it as a necessary part of existence. Cerberus represented the enforcement of that natural law. He wasn't evil, he was doing his job, maintaining the boundary that separated life from death, ensuring that the two realms didn't become confused or mixed. But that didn't make him less terrifying. If anything, knowing that he was there deliberately, that the gods had placed him at the gates for the specific purpose of preventing escape, made him more horrifying because it meant death was meant to be final, was designed to be inescapable. Why does Cerberus rank number 6 and not higher? Because ultimately, Cerberus was containable. He stayed at his post, guarded his gates, didn't roam the world causing destruction. If You didn't try to enter or leave the underworld inappropriately. You'd never encounter him. His danger was enormous but geographically limited. His purpose specific rather than general mayhem. But Cerberus's place in Greek mythology is unique because he represents something different from the other monsters on this list. He wasn't punishment for transgression, wasn't a curse or a transformed victim, wasn't chaos made flesh. He was order. He was the boundary made real, the rule made creature, the enforcement of cosmic law, and in some ways, that makes him more terrifying than random chaos ever could be, because Cerberus represented the fact that some limits are real, some boundaries cannot be crossed, and death for all of humanity's efforts and prayers and heroes' quests remains the one journey from which almost no one returns. The ancient Greeks, preparing their dead for burial, would place a coin in the deceased's mouth to pay Charon the ferryman, but they rarely left offerings for Cerberus because they understood that the hound didn't need bribes or prayers. He had his job assigned by the gods, and he would do it perfectly, eternally, without mercy or exception, until the end of time itself. And knowing that he waited there at the gates with his multiple heads and serpent mane and bronze paws, ready to devour any shade that tried to escape death's realm, made the finality of death even more absolute and terrifying. Figure 5, the Minotaur, Bullman in the Maze. Halfway through our countdown, we arrive at one of the most famous monsters in all of Greek mythology. A creature so iconic that its image has been reproduced in art, literature, and popular culture for thousands of years. But familiarity shouldn't breed contempt, because when we really examine the Minotaur story, when we understand what he was, and why he existed, and what happened to those who faced him, we realize that this half-man, half-bull, kept in a labyrinth represents horrors that resonate as strongly today as they did in ancient Crete. The Minotaur's origin is a tale of divine punishment, unnatural lust, and ingenious but horrifying consequences. It begins with King Minos of Crete, a powerful ruler who had prayed to Poseidon for a sign confirming his right to rule. Poseidon answered by sending a magnificent white bull from the sea, so beautiful, so perfect, that Minos was supposed to sacrifice it back to the god as an offering of gratitude. But Minos looked at that beautiful bull and couldn't bear to kill it. He kept the bull for himself, substituting an inferior animal for the sacrifice, hoping Poseidon wouldn't notice or care. This was a terrible mistake. The gods always notice, and they always care when mortals try to cheat them. Poseidon's revenge was creative, cruel, and would have lasting consequences for Crete and Athens. The god cursed Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, with an unnatural lust for the white bull. She became obsessed with the creature, consumed by a desire that was both humiliating and impossible to fulfill. In desperation, Pasiphae turned to Daedalus, the legendary craftsman and inventor who served Minos' court. She begged him to help her satisfy this unholy passion. Daedalus, though surely horrified by the request, was bound to serve the queen. He constructed an elaborate artifice, a hollow wooden cow covered with real cowhide, realistic enough to fool the bull. Pasiphae climbed inside this false cow, positioning herself within it, and Daedalus placed the construction in the field where the white bull grazed. The bull, deceived by the artificial cow, mounted it, and Pasiphae, inside, achieved her cursed desire. The union was consummated, woman and bull mating, through Daedalus's construction, fulfilling the curse Poseidon had placed upon her. But this unnatural coupling had consequences. Pasiphae became pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to a creature that was neither fully human nor fully bull. The Minotaur had a man's body but a bull's head, or in some versions, a human head on a bull's body, or a hybrid mixing human and bull features throughout. The creature was powerful, aggressive, and developed an appetite for human flesh. Minos named him Asterion, meaning starry one, but history would know him by his descriptive name, the Minotaur, literally the bull of Minos. Minos faced a problem. This creature was his wife's offspring, making it technically part of the royal family, but it was also a monster that killed and devoured people. He couldn't kill it. Some combination of family loyalty, guilt over his own role in creating the situation, and possibly divine prohibition. But he couldn't let it roam free either. Once again, he turned to Daedalus. The craftsman built his most famous creation, the labyrinth at Knossos. This wasn't just a maze in the usual sense. This was an architectural impossibility, a structure so complex and confusing that anyone who entered without knowledge of its secrets would become hopelessly lost. The corridors twisted back on themselves, intersected at impossible angles, led to dead ends and false exits. Once inside, you would wander forever, unable to find your way out, growing increasingly desperate and disoriented until you either died of thirst and starvation or encountered the Minotaur itself. At the center of this labyrinth, Minos imprisoned the Minotaur. The creature lived in darkness, in endless twisting corridors, alone with its hunger and its rage. And there it would have stayed, perhaps, harming no one, if not for another piece of the story. Minos' son, Androgeus, had gone to Athens and been killed, either murdered out of jealousy for his athletic victories, or sent to fight the marathon bull and killed in the process. Regardless of the exact details, Minos held Athens responsible for his son's death. He waged war on Athens, and when he won, he imposed a terrible tribute. Every 9 years, or every year, depending on the source, Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete. These 14 Athenian youths would be forced into the labyrinth as food for the Minotaur. They would be given no weapons, no tools, no guidance, just pushed into the maze and the great bronze doors sealed behind them. Imagine being one of those Athenian youths. You're in the prime of life, full of potential, with your whole future ahead of you. Then your name is drawn in the lottery that selects Minos' tribute. You have to say goodbye to your family, knowing you'll never return. You're loaded onto a ship with 13 others, children of other families, friends, strangers, all bound together by shared doom. The ship sails to Crete. You're marched to the labyrinth. The massive bronze doors open, revealing darkness and twisting corridors that disappear into shadow. And then you're pushed inside with the others, and the doors slam shut behind you, and you hear the lock sliding into place. The terror of the labyrinth was multifaceted. First, there was the simple horror of being lost. You wander the corridors, trying to find a pattern, trying to remember which turns you've taken. But the maze defeats all attempts at mapping. You encounter the same passages from different directions and can't tell if you're going deeper or circling back. Time loses meaning in the darkness. You hear the voices of other tributes calling out, and you try to stay together, but the maze separates you, leads you apart, until you're alone, And always there's the knowledge that somewhere in this darkness, the Minotaur waits. You don't know where. You don't know when you might turn a corner and find it there. Every shadow could be the monster. Every sound might be its approach. The fear becomes a constant thing, a pressure on your mind that makes thinking difficult, makes sleep impossible, makes every moment an exercise in controlled terror. Eventually, maybe hours, maybe days later, you hear it. The sound of hooves on stone. A snorting, snuffling sound that echoes through the corridors. The Minotaur following the scent of human flesh, hunting through its domain. And you run, desperately trying to flee. But the maze works against you. You turn corners and hit dead ends. You find yourself in the same corridors you just left. And the sounds get closer. When the Minotaur catches you, and it will catch you, because this is its home, its territory, the place it has lived its entire existence. There's no fight you can win. It has a bull's strength combined with human intelligence, or at least cunning. Hands to grab and horns to gore. It kills quickly, at least. And then it feeds. The bones of previous victims litter the labyrinth's corridors. Warnings that go unheeded because no one who sees them survives to tell others. This tribute continued for years. Athens sent its youths, 14 every cycle, dozens, or even hundreds in total, into the labyrinth to die. The Minotaur became a legend of horror, a monster that represented the price of war, the cruelty of conquerors, and the helplessness of facing death in a trap from which there's no escape. The tribute finally ended when Theseus, Prince of Athens, volunteered as one of the 14 tributes with a secret plan to slay the Minotaur. With help from Ariadne, Minos' daughter, who fell in love with Theseus, the hero entered the labyrinth armed with a sword and carrying a ball of thread. Ariadne had given him the thread and told him to tie one end at the entrance and unravel it as he explored, creating a lifeline back to the exit. Theseus navigated the labyrinth, following its twisting paths until he found the Minotaur at its center. The battle was fierce. Theseus with his sword against the Minotaur's horns and strength. But Theseus was a trained warrior, and the Minotaur, for all its power, was essentially a solitary creature unused to fighting someone who fought back effectively. Theseus killed the monster, then followed Ariadne's thread back through the maze, leading the other Athenian tributes to safety. The Minotaur's death ended the tribute and freed Athens from its obligation. But the tragedy of the monster itself, a creature born from a curse, innocent of its own origin, imprisoned in darkness, forced into the role of executioner for crimes it didn't commit, adds a layer of pathos to its horror. The Minotaur didn't choose to exist, didn't choose to be half bull and half human, didn't choose to crave human flesh or to live in a maze. It was a victim of its parents' actions and divine punishment, even as it became a victimizer of innocent Athenian youths. The labyrinth itself remains one of mythology's most potent symbols, a place of confusion, entrapment, and inescapability. It represents bureaucracy gone mad, rules that lead nowhere, systems designed to confuse rather than clarify. It's the nightmare of being lost without any reference points, without any hope of finding your way out, slowly dying in darkness while something hunts you. The Minotaur ranks number 5 because it combines physical danger with psychological horror, with tragic origins. It's not just a beast to be slain. It's a curse made flesh, divine punishment incarnated, and the unwilling executioner of innocence. The creature in the maze represents the fear of being sacrificed for others' crimes, of being lost without hope of rescue, of dying alone in darkness while a monster closes in. And it reminds us that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are those created by human choices and divine revenge, trapped in roles they never chose, destroying others because they themselves were destroyed first. Or 4. The Chimera. 3 beasts, 1 body. We've reached number 4 on our countdown, and here we encounter a creature so fundamentally wrong in its very existence that its name has become synonymous with impossible fantasy and genetic impossibility. The Chimera, a fusion of multiple animals that shouldn't coexist in a single body, but which Greek mythology brought together in one of its most nightmarish creations. The Chimera was yet another offspring of Typhon and Echidna. This monstrous couple's reproductive legacy fills our entire countdown, but where her siblings often combine human and animal features or multiplied single features like heads, the Chimera took fusion to its most extreme. She was quite literally 3 different animals inhabiting one body, each animal fully formed and functional, each capable of independent attack, creating a creature that defied logic, anatomy, and everything we understand about how bodies should work. The core body of the Chimera was that of a lion, powerful, tawny, with massive muscles and razor-sharp claws. Lion-like strength filled her primary form, giving her the ability to run down prey, leap enormous distances, and tear through armor and flesh with ease. Her front legs were lion's paws, her primary head that of a lion, complete with fearsome fangs and the crushing bite force that makes lions apex predators. But from the middle of her spine, where a normal lion's back would curve smoothly, from shoulders to haunches, a second animal emerged. A goat sprouted from the Chimera's back, not as a growth or deformity, but as a fully formed creature sharing the lion's body. The goat had its own head, its own neck, its own forelegs that dangled uselessly, or perhaps found some purchase on the lion's flanks. This goat head was alive, aware, capable of independent movement and attack, complete with the curved horns of a male goat that could gore and bash. And if a lion body with a goat growing from its back wasn't nightmare-inducing enough, the Chimera's tail was replaced by a serpent. Not a snake-like tail, but an actual serpent with its own head, fangs dripping venom, capable of striking independently of whatever the lion and goat heads were doing. Some artistic depictions show the serpent as thick as a man's leg, long enough to give the Chimera additional reach, its head rearing back to strike at enemies that thought they'd gotten behind the monster. Now imagine trying to fight this thing. You approach the Chimera, weapon ready, preparing for a beast you understand how to battle, but then you see it clearly. 3 heads, each one capable of attacking from different angles, each one with different weapons. The lion head will try to bite you, using powerful jaws to crush bone and tear flesh. The goat head will try to ram you with its horns, aiming for your chest or gut, trying to knock you down where the lion can finish you. And the serpent tail is constantly striking, trying to inject venom that will paralyze or kill you within minutes. You can't watch all 3 heads at once. While you're defending against the lion's bite, the goat might gore you from above. While you're dodging the goat's horns, the serpent strikes your leg, There's no angle of approach that's safe. No way to engage with one head without leaving yourself vulnerable to the others. It's like fighting three separate animals that coordinate their attacks perfectly because they share one body. But even that wouldn't make the Chimera number 4 on our list if physical attributes were her only horror. The truly terrifying aspect of the Chimera was that she breathed fire. Not metaphorical fire, not hot breath that felt like fire, actual flames that poured from her mouth or mouths, depending on the source, incinerating anyone who got too close. The mechanics of the fire breathing varied by source. Some claimed only the lion head breathed fire. Others said all 3 heads could spout flames. Some descriptions suggested that the goat head was the primary fire source, bellowing flames that would then be directed by the lion head. Regardless of the exact mechanism, the result was the same. The Chimera could kill at range, burning warriors alive in their armor, setting entire areas ablaze, making it impossible to get close enough to strike her without being incinerated. Fire in the ancient world was even more terrifying than it might seem to us today. There was no effective way to extinguish flames quickly. If your clothing caught fire, if your shield burned, if the grass around you ignited, you were likely dead or horribly maimed. The Chimera's fire breathing meant she controlled the battlefield, determining how close enemies could approach, creating kill zones of flame that no one could cross. The beast ravaged Lycia, a region in Anatolia, modern Turkey, terrorizing the countryside, killing livestock, burning fields, and devouring anyone unfortunate enough to encounter her. King Iobates of Lycia desperately wanted the monster dead, but none of his warriors could defeat it. 3 heads that attacked independently, fire breath that kept opponents at bay, and the strength of a lion, the viciousness of a goat, and the venom of a serpent combined made the Chimera effectively unbeatable by normal means. Enter Bellerophon, a Greek hero who had been sent to Iobates by King Proetus of Tiryns, who secretly hoped Bellerophon would die fighting the Chimera because the hero had rejected the advances of Proetus's wife, and the spurned woman had lied about Bellerophon assaulting her. So Bellerophon found himself facing a monster that was supposed to be his death sentence, a creature no one had managed to survive, let alone defeat. But Bellerophon had an advantage no other Chimera hunter possessed. Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's blood, had been tamed by Bellerophon with Athena's help, giving the hero the ability to fight from the air. This aerial capability was crucial because it meant Bellerophon didn't have to get within range of all 3 heads simultaneously, didn't have to worry about the fire breath as much, and could attack from angles the Chimera couldn't easily defend. Bellerophon also had a crucial piece of advice, possibly from a seer or the gods themselves. He armed himself with a spear tipped with lead. The plan was ingenious and horrifying in equal measure. Bellerophon would fly on Pegasus above the Chimera, then dive and drive the lead-tipped spear into the creature's mouth, specifically into the throat of the fire-breathing head. The battle began with Bellerophon circling on Pegasus, while the Chimera roared and breathed gouts of flame skyward, trying to burn both horse and rider from the air. But Pegasus was too swift, too maneuverable. When the moment came, Bellerophon dove, aiming carefully, and drove his spear deep into the Chimera's throat, lodging the lead tip in the creature's fire-producing organ. The chimera's own fire did the rest. The lead, a soft metal with a low melting point, began to heat from the monster's internal flames. It melted, running in molten streams, down the chimera's throat, burning tissue, blocking airways, cooking the creature from the inside. The chimera thrashed and roared, all three heads screaming in agony. But there was no way to remove the molten metal, no way to stop the internal burning. Finally, the great composite beast collapsed and died. Victim of its own fire, turned against it through clever tactics. The chimera's death didn't just end a threat to Lycia. It entered language and culture as a symbol of the impossible made real. The word chimera now means any illusion or fabrication, any hope or dream that's ultimately unattainable, any creature that's a composite of disparate elements. It represents genetic impossibility, biological absurdity, the creature that shouldn't exist, but which, in mythology's logic, absolutely does exist and is terrifyingly effective. The chimera also represents a very specific fear: the composite threat, the enemy that attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The problem that has no single solution, because it's actually several problems fused together. You can't defend against a lion and a goat and a serpent all at once. You can't approach close enough to fight without being burned. You can't use conventional tactics against an unconventional threat. What makes the chimera number 4 on our list is the combination of physical impossibility with lethality. This is a creature that shouldn't be able to exist. The square cube law of biology, basic anatomy, the requirements of supporting 3 separate heads on one body, the energy expenditure of producing fire, all should make the chimera impossible. But it did exist, and it was one of the most dangerous monsters in Greek mythology, requiring a hero mounted on a flying horse and armed with a clever weapon, just to have a chance at survival. The chimera died once, killed by Bellerophon's intelligence and Pegasus's mobility. But in imagination, the chimera never dies. It remains the ultimate composite beast, the creature that combines predator, prey animal, and venomous serpent into one body, then adds fire, breath for good measure. It's the nightmare of facing something that attacks from every direction, that has no weakness you can exploit, that requires you to be creative rather than just brave, if you want any hope of survival. And the image sticks. A lion with a goat sprouting from its back, and a serpent for a tail, 3 heads biting and goring and striking, while flames pour from mouths that shouldn't be able to produce fire. It's wrong. It's impossible. It shouldn't work. And that's precisely what makes it so terrifying. The chimera proved that in Greek mythology, the laws of nature were suggestions the gods could ignore when creating monsters, and the results were creatures that broke every rule while remaining perfectly, lethally functional. Number 3, Medusa, the Gorgon, whose glance means stone. We've reached the top 3 on our countdown, and here we meet perhaps the most famous monster in all of Greek mythology. A creature whose image has been reproduced for millennia, whose name is instantly recognizable, whose power was so profound that even in death her severed head remained a weapon of terrifying effectiveness. She is Medusa, and her story is one of beauty destroyed, innocence punished, and a curse so absolute that a single glance meant instant, irreversible transformation into lifeless stone. Medusa was one of 3 Gorgons, monstrous sisters born to the ancient sea deities Phorcys and Ceto. whose offspring catalog reads like a guide to Greek nightmares. Her sisters were Stheno, the strong, and Euryala, the far-roaming. And unlike Medusa, they were immortal from birth, deathless beings who would exist forever. But Medusa was mortal, and that mortality would ultimately prove crucial to her mythology. In the earliest versions of the myth, Medusa was born a monster, hideous from birth, terrifying from her first moment of existence, but the version that has dominated Western imagination, the one preserved by the Roman poet Ovid, and which resonates most strongly with modern audiences, tells a very different story. Medusa was once beautiful. In this version, Medusa was a stunning maiden, a woman of such remarkable beauty that she caught the attention of gods and mortals alike. She served as a priestess in Athena's temple, a position of honor that required virginity and devotion. Medusa took her vows seriously, dedicating herself to the goddess of wisdom, spending her days in sacred service, keeping herself pure for Athena. But Poseidon, god of the seas, noticed Medusa. He was struck by her beauty, consumed by desire for her. And Poseidon, like many Greek gods, was not inclined to take no for an answer. He pursued Medusa, cornered her in Athena's own temple, and raped her, violating both the woman and the sanctuary simultaneously, desecrating the sacred space with his assault. When Athena discovered what had happened in her temple, she was enraged. But her rage, in that bitterly unfair logic that ancient mythology sometimes employed, fell not on Poseidon, who was too powerful to punish, a fellow Olympian she couldn't easily oppose, but on Medusa, the victim. Whether Athena blamed Medusa for the violation, considered her polluted by the assault, or simply needed someone to punish for the temple's desecration, the goddess cursed her former priestess with a transformation that would define Medusa forever. Athena turned Medusa's beautiful hair, the feature people had most admired, the physical attribute Medusa had reportedly taken pride in, into a mass of living serpents. Venomous snakes replaced her hair, writhing constantly, hissing, ready to strike, turning her head into a nest of death. Her skin became bronze or greenish, scaled like a serpent in some descriptions. Golden wings sprouted from her back, though whether these were a gift or part of the curse remains ambiguous. They allowed her to fly, but also marked her as no longer fully human. Her hands became bronze, hard as metal, sharp as claws. But the most significant change, the aspect of the curse that made Medusa truly monstrous, was her gaze. Anyone who looked directly into Medusa's eyes, anyone who made eye contact with the cursed woman, would instantly be transformed into stone. Not frozen, not paralyzed, but actually turned into solid rock, their flesh and blood and bone transmuted instantly into lifeless sculpture. Think about what this means. Medusa couldn't look at anyone ever again. Every person who saw her face would die, turned to stone in an instant. She couldn't call for help, couldn't beg for forgiveness, couldn't even maintain eye contact during a conversation. Any interaction with another being had to be conducted with her eyes averted, looking away, ensuring that no accidental glance would kill. She retreated to the edges of the world, specifically to an island somewhere beyond the ocean, in a place far from human civilization. There she lived with her Gorgon sisters, surrounded by the stone statues of those who had come before, men who had tried to kill her, travelers who had stumbled upon her by accident, warriors who had been sent to slay the monster, but who had made the fatal mistake of looking at her directly. Imagine Medusa's daily existence. She wakes surrounded by stone figures, the petrified remains of people who are technically still alive, distant in some cosmic sense. Their consciousness perhaps trapped inside stone bodies, unable to move or communicate or die. These statues are everywhere, a garden of the petrified, each one representing a moment when Medusa's curse activated, when someone's life ended because they looked at her face. She cannot leave because anywhere she goes, more people will turn to stone. She cannot seek help because anyone who tries to help her will die if they look at her. She's trapped by her own face, imprisoned by a curse she didn't deserve, made monstrous by a goddess who should have protected her. The snakes that replaced her hair hiss, constantly reminding her with every sound of what she's become. And then Perseus arrived. He was on a quest imposed by King Polydectes, who wanted Medusa's head as a wedding gift. Though really, Polydectes hoped Perseus would die trying, removing the young hero as an obstacle to the king's designs on Perseus's mother. Perseus shouldn't have had any chance of success. How do you fight an enemy whose mere glance kills you instantly? But Perseus had divine assistance. Athena, perhaps feeling some guilt over her earlier curse, or perhaps simply wanting Medusa dead, gave Perseus a polished bronze shield, bright as a mirror. Hermes contributed winged sandals that allowed flight and a specially sharpened sword. Hades provided his helm of invisibility. The Graia, earlier on our list, were forced to reveal the location of supernatural equipment that Perseus needed. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus approached the island where the Gorgons lived. He found Medusa sleeping, surrounded by her petrified victims, exhausted by her lonely existence. And here's where the accounts diverge uncomfortably. Perseus killed Medusa while she slept. The hero who was supposed to be honorable, the man on a noble quest, murdered an unconscious woman or monster, depending on your perspective, while she was defenseless. But Perseus was clever. He didn't look at Medusa directly. Instead, he used Athena's polished shield as a mirror, viewing Medusa's reflection while approaching her. The reflection didn't petrify. Only direct eye contact activated the curse. Guided by the mirror image, Perseus positioned himself carefully, raised his sword, and brought it down in a single stroke that severed Medusa's head. The moment the sword cut through her neck, two creatures sprang from Medusa's body: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword. These were Poseidon's children, conceived during the rape in Athena's temple, growing within Medusa's body for years until released by her death. So Medusa had been pregnant this entire time, carrying the offspring of her rapist while cursed for being raped, and her children only gained life when she lost hers. Perseus grabbed Medusa's severed head and stuffed it into a special bag, the kiboisis, that could contain its power. But even severed, even dead, Medusa's head retained its petrifying ability. Perseus would use it as a weapon repeatedly during his journey home, turning a sea monster to stone to save Andromeda, petrifying King Polydectes and his court to rescue his mother, using the dead Gorgon's power to kill his own enemies. Eventually, Perseus gave Medusa's head to Athena, who placed it on her aegis, her shield or breastplate, where it would remain forever, a trophy of the goddess's victory over the priestess she had cursed. The head continued to function even there, its power eternal, its gaze still deadly. Medusa's face frozen in death, serving as a protective symbol for the goddess who had destroyed her. Medusa's image, the Gorgoneion, became one of the most popular protective symbols in ancient Greece. Her severed head appeared on shields, on temple facades, in mosaics, on coins, on jewelry. The idea was that Medusa's frightening face would ward off evil, that her apotropaic power would protect rather than destroy. But there's a bitter irony in using the image of a cursed rape victim as a good luck charm, in making a decorative element from the face of a woman punished for being victimized. What makes Medusa number 3 on our list? It's the combination of absolute power with absolute tragedy, the mix of being genuinely dangerous while also being genuinely wronged, and the fact that her curse operated at a fundamental level that made her nearly unbeatable. The petrifying gaze wasn't something you could armor against or dodge. One glance, one instant of eye contact, and you were stone forever. No chance to react, no opportunity to defend, just immediate transformation from living being to lifeless sculpture. But Medusa's horror also comes from the victim to monster arc. She didn't choose monstrousness. She was made monstrous by divine curse, punished for a crime committed against her, transformed from beauty into terror through no fault of her own. Every person she turned to stone afterward was, in a sense, another victim of Athena's curse. Another person who died because a goddess decided to punish the victim rather than the perpetrator of assault. Modern interpretations have reclaimed Medusa as a symbol of female rage, of justified anger at injustice, of a power reclaimed from victimhood. Her image on shields and jewelry is reinterpreted not as frightening but as fierce, a declaration that some women refuse to remain victims, that there is power in rage, that transformation, even into something the world calls monstrous, can be a form of survival and resistance. But in the original mythology, Medusa was tragedy personified, beautiful and cursed, victimized and transformed, dangerous and doomed. She lived in isolation, surrounded by stone evidence of her curse's power, unable to connect with anyone, unable to change back, unable to die until Perseus came, but unable to truly live either. And when death finally came, it came while she slept, came without warning, came from a hero who would be celebrated for killing her, while she would be remembered as just a monster. Her story of victimhood largely forgotten, until modern reinterpretations gave her back her voice. Medusa ranks third because she represents the ultimate transformation of innocent into monster, because her power operated on such a fundamental level that defeating her required divine intervention and mirror tricks, and because even in death her severed head remained so dangerous that it needed a special bag to contain it. But most of all, she ranks here because her story demonstrates that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those created by the gods from people who never wanted to be monstrous, who were made into nightmare by forces they couldn't control, and who spent their existence as living proof that divine justice isn't always just. Trina 2. The Lernaean Hydra, heads that multiply. As we reach the penultimate position on our countdown, we encounter a creature that epitomizes a specific kind of nightmare. The problem that gets worse the more you try to solve it. The enemy that grows stronger every time you damage it. The battle where every victory leads to greater danger. This is the Lernaean Hydra, and its legendary regenerating heads have made it one of the most iconic monsters in mythology, and the literal namesake for problems that multiply when you try to fix them. The Hydra was born, like so many terrors on our list, from the union of Typhon and Echidna. Its sibling were the Chimera, Cerberus, the Sphinx, and various other nightmares. But the Hydra possessed a power unique even among this monstrous family. It could heal faster than it could be hurt, and in the process of healing, it became more dangerous than before. The Hydra appeared as an enormous serpent with multiple heads. The exact number of heads varied wildly by source. Hesiod said 9, Simonides claimed 50, while other writers suggested hundreds. Some artistic depictions show as few as 5 heads, while others show forests of serpentine necks emerging from a central body. But the precise number mattered less than the creature's defining characteristic. For every head cut off, 2 more would grow in its place. Think about the mathematics of this ability. Start with 9 heads. Cut 1 off, now you have 10. Cut off 2 more, now you have 13. Continue the battle, and the Hydra becomes exponentially more dangerous with every successful attack. What begins as a difficult but potentially manageable fight becomes impossible as the number of heads multiplies. Eventually, you're facing dozens or hundreds of snapping, biting serpent heads, and you're the one who created them by trying to kill the monster. But the Hydra's horror went far beyond numerical multiplication. The creature possessed breath and blood that were lethally poisonous. Ancient sources claimed that merely breathing the air around the Hydra could kill a person, that the fumes rising from its swampy lair were toxic enough to cause fatal poisoning. Walk too close to the Hydra's domain, and you might die before even seeing the monster. And if the poisonous breath didn't kill you, the blood certainly would. The Hydra's blood was so venomous that the smallest drop could kill within minutes or even seconds. If it splashed on your skin during battle, you died. If a tiny amount got in a wound, you died. Later, after Heracles had killed the Hydra, he would dip his arrows in its blood, creating poison weapons that inflicted incurable wounds. Wounds that would eventually cause even the mighty Heracles himself to die in agony. The Hydra made its lair in the swamps of Lerna, near Argos, in the Peloponnese. This wasn't random habitat selection. Lerna was believed to be one of the entrances to the underworld, a place where the boundary between the living world and the realm of Hades was thin. The Hydra served as a guardian of this entrance, preventing unauthorized travel between worlds, maintaining the cosmic order through sheer deadliness. The swamp itself became contaminated by the Hydra's presence. The water turned foul and poisonous. The air became thick with toxic fumes, and the land around the marsh died. Animals wouldn't graze nearby. Birds wouldn't fly overhead. And the region became a dead zone where the only life was the Hydra itself, coiled in its muddy lair, its many heads swaying above the water, waiting. King Eurystheus, cousin of Heracles and the man who assigned him the famous 12 labors, sent Heracles to kill the Hydra as the second labor. Eurystheus was working with Hera, Zeus's wife, who hated Heracles for being Zeus's illegitimate son. They both hoped the Hydra would kill Heracles, and they had good reason to hope. The monster had never been defeated, had killed everyone who challenged it, and its regenerating head seemed to make victory impossible. Heracles approached the Lerna swamp with his nephew Iolaus, as his chariot driver and assistant. They found the Hydra in its lair, a massive serpentine creature with multiple heads swaying on long necks. Heracles attacked, wielding his club, smashing one of the Hydra's heads with a powerful blow. The head was destroyed, but from the stump 2 new heads immediately sprouted, fully formed and functional. Heracles attacked again, destroying another head. 2 more grew back. He increased his assault, striking multiple heads, but for every one he destroyed, 2 replaced it. The Hydra was literally becoming more dangerous as the battle continued. Worse, the Hydra wasn't fighting alone. Hera, watching from Olympus and furious that Heracles was still alive, sent additional help to her pet monster. A massive crab, sometimes called Carcanos or Cancer, emerged from the swamp and grabbed Heracles' foot, trying to hold him in place while the multiplying Hydra heads struck at him from all sides. Heracles crushed the crab with his foot, killing Hera's assistant. Later, Hera would honor this faithful crab by placing it in the stars as the constellation Cancer. But the Hydra remained, growing more heads with each attack, becoming an increasingly impossible opponent. This is when Iolaus came up with the solution: fire. If they could cauterize the neck stumps before new heads could grow, they might prevent the regeneration. It was a risk. Get too close to apply fire, and the poison breath or blood might kill you. But it was the only chance they had. Iolaus lit a torch from a nearby burning tree and brought it to the battle. The new strategy emerged. Heracles would strike a head with his sword, severing it cleanly, immediately, before the wound could begin regenerating. Iolaus would press the burning torch against the stump, searing the flesh, cauterizing the wound. The scorched tissue couldn't generate new heads, and slowly, painfully, the 2 men worked through the Hydra's many heads. But there was a complication that neither Heracles nor Iolaus had known about. One of the Hydra's heads was immortal. It couldn't be killed, couldn't be burned away, would survive any wound, and regenerate regardless of what was done to it. When Heracles finally cut off this central, immortal head, he realized it couldn't be destroyed. So he did the only thing possible. He buried it. Heracles dug a deep pit, placed the still living, still snapping, immortal head into the ground, and rolled an enormous boulder on top of it, sealing it beneath tons of rock where it couldn't hurt anyone. Ancient Greeks claimed you could still see that boulder on the road near Lerna, and they believed that beneath it, the Hydra's immortal head remained alive, trapped but never dying, eternally imprisoned but eternally existing. With the immortal head buried and the other heads destroyed and cauterized, the Hydra finally died. Its massive body collapsed in the swamp, poisoning the water even further with its death. Heracles, ever practical, dipped his arrows into the creature's blood, coating them with poison that would make any wound fatal. These poison arrows would become some of the most dangerous weapons in Greek mythology. But Eurystheus declared that this labor didn't count. Heracles had received help from Iolaus, and according to the rules Eurystheus had established, the labors had to be completed alone. This refusal to count the Hydra's death is why Heracles ended up performing 12 labors instead of the originally assigned 10. 2 labors were rejected on technicalities, forcing Heracles to complete additional tasks. The Hydra's defeat, however, didn't erase its influence. The creature became the template for a specific type of problem, one that multiplies when you try to solve it. In modern language, we call these Hydra problems. Cut off one head of the problem, and two more grow back. Try to fix one aspect of a complex issue, and you create two new complications. Attack one part of a system, and the system adapts, becoming more resistant. This concept appears everywhere. In biology, cancer cells. In computer science, debugging code that creates new bugs. In politics, policies that create more problems than they solve. In economics, interventions that have unintended multiplier effects. In social systems, solutions that exacerbate the very issues they're meant to fix. The Hydra's legacy is this understanding that some problems can't be solved by direct attack, that sometimes fighting makes things worse, that you need clever strategy rather than brute force. The Hydra ranks number 2 on our countdown because it represents the nightmare of progressive difficulty, the horror of watching your enemy become stronger because you're trying to kill it. Every blow you land against the Hydra makes it more dangerous. Every attack creates more threats. The battle becomes exponentially harder as it continues, until you're overwhelmed by threats you yourself created through your attempts to win. It's also the nightmare of fighting an enemy that can be conventionally defeated. The Hydra can't be killed through normal combat. You can't simply hack at it until it dies because hacking makes it stronger. You need knowledge, cauterization, assistance, iolaus, persistence, destroying every head, and acceptance that some parts, the immortal head, can't be killed but only contained. The Hydra embodies the fear that some enemies are unbeatable, some problems unsolvable, some threats permanent. That immortal head, buried under a boulder but still alive, still potentially dangerous if ever freed, represents the understanding that some dangers can only be managed, never eliminated. You can bury them, contain them, keep them from harming people, but they remain waiting eternal threats that will outlast civilizations. Only one creature on our list surpasses the Hydra in terror and power. Only one monster represents our greater threat, embodies more fundamental horror, and challenge the gods themselves more completely. And that monster is the one who fathered the Hydra and most other creatures on this list. 1. Typhon. The father of all monsters, we have reached number 1 on our countdown. The most terrifying monster in all of Greek mythology. The creature that came closer than anyone or anything else to overthrowing Zeus and the Olympian gods, and plunging the cosmos back into primordial chaos. This is Typhon, the father of monsters, the storm giant, the most powerful adversary the gods ever faced. A being so immense that his head brushed the stars, while his arms stretched from the eastern to the western edges of the world. Typhon's birth itself was an act of cosmic revenge. After the Olympians had defeated the Titans in the Titanomachy, imprisoning them in Tartarus, and after they had further defeated the giants in the Gigantomachy, Gaia, the primordial earth herself, looked upon her defeated children and swore vengeance. She went to Tartarus, the deepest abyss, the place of ultimate darkness and imprisonment, and there she mated with Tartarus himself, the place personified. From this union of earth and the abyss was born Typhon, explicitly created to destroy Zeus, to tear down the Olympian order, to avenge the titans and giants and restore the ancient powers. Typhon wasn't born randomly or accidentally. He was designed as a weapon, crafted specifically to be Zeus's equal or superior, to embody every force the sky god couldn't easily counter. Typhon's size defied comprehension. Ancient descriptions claim he was so tall that his head reached the stars, that he could stand with one foot in the Eastern Ocean and the other in the Western Sea, that his bulk blotted out the sun when he moved. He wasn't just large, he was geographically large, existing at a scale where he was essentially a walking mountain, a living force of nature as much as a creature. His upper body was humanoid in shape, a man's torso, arms, and head, giving him human-like intelligence and the ability to wield strategy along with raw power. But where his legs should have been, his body dissolved into hundreds of serpents, massive snake coils that writhed and twisted, allowing him to move with terrifying speed despite his enormous size. Some sources describe his lower body as a single mass of coils, while others claim each leg was actually a cluster of serpent bodies, creating a being that was half man, half serpent Hydra. But Typhon's most terrifying features were his heads. Not multiple heads like Cerberus or the Hydra, but something even more unsettling. 100 dragon heads, growing from his shoulders, neck, and possibly arms. 100 heads, each one capable of breathing fire, each one capable of speaking. And here's the truly disturbing part. Each head spoke in a different voice. The heads could bark like dogs, roar like lions, hiss like serpents, bellow like bulls, and speak in human languages. Some heads whispered, others screamed. Some heads mimicked the voices of specific gods, the cacophony of 100 voices, all speaking, roaring, hissing, barking, and screaming. Simultaneously must have been overwhelming and deeply unsettling. Each of these dragon heads could breathe fire, not small gouts of flame, but massive streams of fire that could incinerate forests, boil seas, and melt stone. 100 fire-breathing heads meant Typhon could attack in every direction simultaneously, could blanket entire regions in flames, could create walls of fire that nothing could pass through. His eyes blazed with their own internal fire. Looking at Typhon meant seeing eyes like furnaces, glowing with heat and malice, burning with the rage that had birthed him. His breath was flame, his touch was destruction, and his voice, those 100 voices speaking at once, could drive mortals mad with its volume and discordance. Typhon also had wings, enormous pinions that could eclipse the sun when spread, that created hurricane-force winds when he flew, that allowed a creature the size of a mountain to take to the air and blot out the sky. When Typhon flew, the world darkened beneath him. Storms gathered in his wake, and everything living fled in terror. When Typhon emerged from the depths and began his assault on Olympus, the gods panicked. This wasn't like fighting titans or giants. This was something exponentially more powerful, more terrifying, more seemingly invincible. The Olympians, who had defeated every previous threat to their rule, looked at Typhon and saw their own potential extinction. Many gods fled. In one version of the myth, most Olympians transformed into animals and fled to Egypt to hide. Zeus, Athena, and Dionysus remained in their true forms, but even they knew they faced their greatest challenge. Athena reportedly mocked Zeus for considering retreat, shaming him into fighting. But even Zeus's courage was tested by the sight of Typhon approaching. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was cataclysmic. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts, those legendary weapons that had defeated titans and giants, at Typhon. Typhon retaliated with hurricanes, with waves of fire from his 100 mouths, with the sheer physical force of his enormous bulk. The earth shook beneath them, The seas boiled. The sky turned black with smoke and storm clouds. Mountains were uprooted and thrown as weapons. Islands were submerged or created by the forces unleashed. The heat from their battle was so intense that it began to melt the boundaries between the mortal world and Tartarus. The primordial forces of chaos threatened to break through back into the ordered cosmos. The very structure of reality was at risk if the battle continued, if neither combatant yielded. In Hesiod's version, Zeus eventually won through superior power and the effectiveness of his thunderbolts. He struck Typhon repeatedly, his divine lightning finally overwhelming the monster's defenses, charring those 100 heads, defeating the creature through sheer concentrated divine might. But other versions tell a more complex story. In Apollodorus' account, the battle went very differently, and much worse for Zeus. Typhon initially won the first engagement, defeating Zeus in combat. But instead of killing the god, Typhon imprisoned him. The monster cut the tendons from Zeus's arms and legs, crippling him completely, then dragged the helpless god to a cave in Cilicia and stood guard over him. Without his tendons, Zeus couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't even stand. He was trapped, helpless, imprisoned by the very monster meant to kill him. Typhon had won. The king of gods was defeated, the Olympians scattered, and it seemed that the cosmic order was about to be overturned. But Hermes and Pan, or in some versions, Hermes and Aijapan, mounted a rescue mission. They sneaked into the cave where Zeus was imprisoned, stole back the stolen tendons while Typhon was distracted, and restored them to Zeus. The god's divine healing ability did the rest. He recovered his strength, regained his powers, and prepared for a second battle. The second confrontation was even more destructive than the first. Zeus, now aware of how dangerous Typhon truly was, fought with everything he had. He called upon every ounce of divine power, unleashed his most devastating thunderbolts, drew on reserves of strength he hadn't needed since the war against the Titans. The battle raged across multiple landscapes, destroying everything in its path. Finally, Zeus gained the upper hand. He struck Typhon with a barrage of thunderbolts so intense, so concentrated, that even the monster's enormous body couldn't withstand it. Typhon began to weaken, to fall, his 100 heads silenced one by one, his fire breathing reduced to smoke and sparks. His immense strength finally depleted. Zeus's final move was to tear up a mountain. Mount Etna in most versions, though some sources say it was a different mountain or that Typhon was cast into Tartarus and hurl it on top of the fallen monster. Typhon, still alive but too weak to resist, was buried beneath the mountain's immense weight, trapped there for eternity. And there Typhon remains. According to Greek mythology, he's imprisoned beneath Mount Etna on Sicily, still alive, still burning with rage, still breathing fire. The volcanic eruptions of Etna aren't geological phenomena. They're Typhon's breath and rage escaping through cracks in his prison, his 100 dragon heads still trying to breathe fire, his enormous body still struggling against the weight pinning him down. The earthquakes that shake Sicily are Typhon writhing in his bonds, trying even after millennia to break free and finish his battle with Zeus. Some sources claim Typhon is imprisoned in Tartarus instead, trapped in the deepest abyss alongside the Titans he was meant to avenge. Others suggest he's buried under various volcanic mountains throughout Greece and Asia Minor. But regardless of the exact location, the message is clear. Typhon couldn't be killed, only imprisoned. He's still there, still alive, still dangerous, waiting for any opportunity to break free and resume his assault on the Olympians. Why is Typhon number one? Because he represents the ultimate threat. Not just physical danger, but cosmic catastrophe. Typhon wasn't fighting for personal revenge or hunger or territory. He was fighting to overthrow the entire order of the cosmos, to return the universe to primordial chaos, to undo everything the Olympians had built. His victory wouldn't have meant just the death of Zeus, but the collapse of the ordered world and a return to the formless void that existed before the gods established their rule. Typhon also represents a scale of terror beyond anything else on this list. The other monsters were dangerous, deadly, horrifying, but they were manageable threats. Heroes could defeat them, gods could handle them. Typhon required Zeus himself, the king of gods, fighting at his absolute maximum capacity, barely winning, and even then only managing to imprison rather than destroy his opponent. The father of monsters ranks first because he fathered most of the other creatures on this countdown. He and Echidna produced the Hydra, the Chimera, Cerberus, the Sphinx, and various other terrors. His genetic legacy is a catalog of nightmares that plagued heroes and mortals throughout Greek mythology. Even imprisoned, even defeated, Typhon's children continued his work of terrorizing the world. But most of all, Typhon embodies the fear of forces beyond human or even divine comprehension. He was born from earth and abyss, created from the most primal forces in existence, designed to be unstoppable when gods flee in terror, when Zeus himself barely survives, when even victory means only imprisonment rather than death. We understand that some threats are so vast, so powerful, so fundamentally dangerous that they can never be fully eliminated, only contained, only managed, only kept at bay through constant vigilance and overwhelming force. The ancient Greeks, seeing volcanic eruptions, experiencing earthquakes, enduring devastating storms, attributed these forces to Typhon, the monster imprisoned but never destroyed, the threat contained but never eliminated, the enemy defeated but never killed. And knowing that beneath the earth, beneath mountains, in the deepest places, Typhon still lived, still raged, still burned with a desire to break free and finish what he started, made every earthquake a reminder that the greatest monster in their mythology remained, waiting for any chance to rise again. Conclusion: the monsters we still fear. We have journeyed through the nightmares of Greek mythology, from the defiling Harpies to the impossible to defeat Typhon, encountering creatures that embodied humanity's deepest fears, being hunted, being transformed, being trapped, being overpowered, and being unable to escape doom no matter how clever or strong or brave we might be. These 10 monsters, and the dozens of others that didn't make our list, weren't random creations. They were carefully crafted embodiments of specific terrors, products of a culture trying to understand and express what truly frightened them. The Greeks feared being lost in mazes they couldn't escape, so they created the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. They feared death's finality, so they imagined Cerberus guarding the gates of Hades. They feared problems that multiplied when attacked, so they conceived the Hydra. They feared transformation from human to monster, so they told Medusas and Scylla stories. And they feared cosmic catastrophe, the possibility that order could collapse back into chaos. So they created Typhon, the ultimate threat, the father of monsters, the being that nearly destroyed the gods themselves. What makes these monsters endure for thousands of years, appearing in art and literature and film and video games, is that the fears they represent are timeless. We still fear being trapped in situations we can't escape. We still fear problems that get worse when we try to fix them. We still fear transformations we can't control and beings we can't defeat. The specifics change. Our modern nightmares might involve different details, but the fundamental terrors remain the same. Greek monsters also teach us about the Greeks themselves. Their society valued cleverness as much as strength, which is why so many monsters couldn't be defeated through brute force alone, but required strategy, intelligence, and often divine assistance. They feared divine punishment, but also divine caprice. Many monsters were created by God's curses, or as tools of divine vengeance, showing a culture that saw the gods as powerful, but not always just. And they understood that some victims become victimizers, some heroes become monsters, and sometimes the boundaries between these categories were far less clear than we'd prefer. These myths persist because they tell truths that statistics and history books cannot. They express psychological and emotional realities through symbol and story, making abstract fears concrete and nameable. When you can put a name and face to your fear, even if that face has 6 dog heads or 100 dragon mouths breathing fire, you've taken the first step toward understanding and perhaps confronting it. If you found this countdown as fascinating as we did researching and presenting it, if learning about these ancient terrors gave you new appreciation for Greek mythology's depth and darkness, please like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our journeys through mythology's most compelling stories. Share this video with anyone who loves monsters, mythology, or understanding the timeless fears that have haunted humanity since we first started telling stories around fires in the dark. Let us know in the comments which monster terrified you most and why, or tell us which legendary creature you think should have made the list. And remember, the next time you see a snake or hear about a problem that seems to multiply when you try to fix it, or feel trapped in a situation with no clear exit, you're encountering the same fears the ancient Greeks felt, the same nightmares they gave form and name to in their myths. These monsters never truly die, they just wait in imagination, ready to remind us that some terrors are eternal, and that understanding our fears might be the first step toward facing them. Stay curious, stay brave, and keep exploring the myths with us.